Welcome to the Theosophical Society and tonight's presentation on the Theraphi. We're going to basically cover the history of electromedicine and give everybody an update on the background of the Theraphi, what it is, how it came into being. So here we go. All right, so basically the history of electricity has been around for some time. Of course, we've always had lightning on this planet, and early man was very curious about lightning. And up into the Greek times, we first started to categorize some of these things. So this is a piece of amber, and the Greeks called it electron, and that's where we get our name electron from. And when you rub the amber with a piece of wool, it would get a static charge, and the Greeks were the first to really take note that it had this sort of attraction effect with small pieces of paper and things like that. And they actually experimented with electricity for health purposes in the early days. They didn't have a source of electricity, so they used things like electric eels and fish and that, because that was the best source of electricity that they actually had. Then around the 1700s, everybody knows the story of Benjamin Franklin, 1752, with his son out here and the kite with the key attached. But the part of the story they don't commonly tell was what he actually did was he had a silk ribbon tied below the kite, and once he got it up in the air, he went into the barn, so he was well away from the area, and a small wire went from this key down to this jar here, which is called a Leyden jar. And the Leyden jar is the first means that we had for actually storing electricity. It contained an electrolyte in here and basically had two electrodes, one being the outer foil around here and then a piece of rod or something like this. Now, of course, this is our modern history. We go back to ancient history, which we've seemed to have forgotten over and over again. And you may have seen pictures of a Baghdad battery that is essentially exactly the same configuration. And then at this point, we hadn't discovered how to turn it into a battery yet. We were just using it as a capacitive device to store the electricity. So you still had to charge that up. And that's how Franklin was doing it, was charging it with the lightning. Then along came this fellow, Luigi Galvani, and this is where we get the word galvanic current from. In the late 1700s, he was a biologist, and he did a lot of dissecting of frogs and trying to understand life and life force. And he actually was working on a dissected frog with his scalpel, and he had brass pins in the frog, and he noticed that when he touched one of the pins, the legs from the frog actually twitched, and he was surprised because all of a sudden it was animated, and he said, wow, this is obviously the life force and the power of God, and the energy of life inside of the frog is still there. And there's some various woodcuts of some of his experiments and devices that he was using to connect them, and he started to realize that it needed some kind of antenna or something. So he thought the animal electricity, is what he called it, it was generated by hooking up antennas to it and things like that. So he hung the frog legs out on fences in a lightning storm, and come to realize that there was an interaction with electricity and biology. So Galvani became the father of bioelectricity, or bioelectromagnetism as we call it in academia today. But then, one of his partners who worked with him, he was a professor of physics in Italy, and his name was Alessandro Volta. He said, well, I think there is something there, but I think Galvani doesn't have it quite right. I don't think this is the animating force of God. There's something more to it. And he started experimenting with that. And that inspired him to come up with the voltaic pile. And this is basically a common battery that we still use today. And it has multiple plates of zinc and copper, and then in between is sort of a cellulose material that he would saturate with some kind of electrolyte, like salt water, very simple things, or even lemon juice. And this created the first modern day battery. So Volta, of course, gets credit. We measure electricity potential in voltage, and that's where we get the name volt from. So what Volta did was he connected his pile to the frog, and he could reproduce every single time this muscular contraction from the nervous system in the frog when it was connected to the voltage. And this sort of started our first understanding of how the biology interacts with electricity. So many papers came out at that time. People were using various forms of electrical generation to have healing effects. So ever since our modern understanding of electricity, we were using it for healing right away. This is sort of a Wimhurst machine or electrostatic generator that she's getting charged up with there. This is a paper in 1870 from France of the effects of electricity on migraine headaches. So everybody in the medical profession at the time, it was a very popular way of doing treatments. And various devices came on the scene at that time. And this is, so this is Volta's pile here, just a standard battery that ran a coil inside of here. And this coil you could adjust the frequency on by changing the casing on it. And it had two handheld electrodes that you basically held onto, and you received the various different frequencies. And people started noting that different resonant frequencies targeted specific ailments. And they're quite popular at the time. You could buy these, you know, in the Sears Roebuck catalog. Even famous companies like Champion, the people that make the spark plugs and modern day coils in your car, were building machines like this. They came with all kinds of electrical attachments for doing massaging and combing your hair, and etc. So that was kind of all inspired by this fellow here who came from Croatia in New York City, Nikola Tesla. And what he said was, if you want to find the secrets of the universe, you have to think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And that was the primary study of Tesla's work. And he created this several laboratories here in New York City and in Colorado, and he worked with very high frequency, very high voltage devices. And the famous Tesla coil, as everybody has heard about today. What's interesting, you remember when you were going to school, you were never taught about Tesla. You were always taught about Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor who invented the light bulb. Well, Edison actually stole the light bulb from the World's Fair in France and brought it to America and popularized it, worked out the details. But what Tesla did was he came up with numerous inventions that he was never really given credit to in a modern sense. Everything from remote controls to generator motor type devices, of course the high frequency Tesla coils, wireless power transmission, and single wire electrical lighting, like similar to what we're using here today. And so all these things Tesla you know, really didn't get much credit for in the history books, because what happened at this time was there's a battle. And Thomas Edison was put all his investment into electrical generation of DC current. And direct current is similar to, it is what the Volta was generating in that voltaic pile in a battery. So that's what most of your battery powered devices still run on today. But the problem with direct current is it cannot transmit over long distances. So it's very good for short lengths of travel, like from the battery in your laptop to the computer itself. But if you tried to put a power line down the street, which was what Edison was doing, he wanted to light New York City with direct current. What happens is the very first light on the street lamps on the street is very bright, but as you go farther down the street, the lights get dimmer and dimmer until the final light at the end is just not even going to be lit up. So the first power sources use most of the electricity. And when Tesla came over from the overseas, given a recommendation to work with Thomas Edison, he brought with him this idea of alternating current. And it was his childhood dream to harness the power of Niagara Falls. And as he studied, he came across the concept and visualization of alternating current. because Tesla really had an eidetic memory, and he had the power of visualization. He was able to completely construct machines and devices in his mind and power them up and run them and see them before he even built them. So he came up with several patents, and he was backed by Westinghouse and a few others, and they ended up building this Wardenclyffe Tower right here on Long Island. And what Tesla said was electric power is everywhere in the universe. It presents us with unlimited quantities and can drive the world's machineries without the need of coal, oil, gas, or any of the other common fuels. So basically what he was saying is that we are able to tap this radiant energy, because really we live in an infinite sea of energy. There's nothing but energy. But these businessmen at that time got wise and figured out how to put a meter on this energy and to actually charge you for it. And that's what we still are doing today. And then of course at the same time oil and gas was being exploited by J.D. Rockefeller and all the refineries, where they actually figured out how to replace the original cars, because the actual original cars were electric. And then Henry Ford came along and he designed a motor that could run on alcohol. Now alcohol was the common fuel at the time, and when you wanted to get gas for your car, you simply pulled into the local farm, because all the farmers grew extra grain and had stills to distill into alcohol, and that's what powered your car. So things happen like Prohibition, and you know, people that had vested interest in these kind of technologies said, okay, we got to come up with a ploy to take over these transportation fuels, and we don't want anybody to be able to make their own fuel. Again, we put a meter on the power system, we want to be able to charge them for it. So they figured out how to emulate combustible fuels, and then put in Prohibition to ban alcohol, and you know, the world is running on gasoline and petrochemicals today. They did the same thing with Rudolf Diesel over in Europe. Diesel came up with the diesel engine, again for the farmers to run it on natural grown fuel. They basically extracted any kind of plant oil, mostly peanut oil, and they were using that oil to run the engine. So again, the Rockefeller discovered how to isolate out those carbon chains inside of the heavy oil that they were pulling out of the ground to emulate the diesel fuel. And Rudolf Diesel ended up face down in the Thames shortly after. So this here fellow is another unknown man in history. His name was Walter Russell. And Walter Russell was an artist, and he didn't have much of an education, and one day he was out in a field and he got hit by lightning and ended up in a coma in the hospital. And when he came to out of that coma, he started bantering all these words about cosmic energies and the power of positive and negative and how the universe worked, and everybody was like, well, we're not sure what he's talking about, but you know, maybe they were going to commit him. They were like, well, obviously he's gone insane from this lightning, but maybe he'll come around, so they kind of let him be. And he ended up writing this book called The Universal One. And so he put all this information that he just kind of downloaded into this book, and he sent it around to all major academic institutions at the time. He made 1,000 copies of them, and he sent them to every scientist and institution. And so people that would have got these would have been people like Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and every university across America and in Europe. And he made 1,000 copies of them, and only one person ever wrote back to him, and that was Nikola Tesla. And what he said was, Walter, I think this is a great book, it's incredible, but I think you're going to have to take it and bury it for 1,000 years, because humanity is not ready for this information yet. And when you read this book, it actually reads like scripture. It's so brilliant. And at that time, we had this basic periodic table, and we were slowly adding all these elements to the periodic table. And Walter Russell came up with a way that was more in coherence with nature, in understanding how the elements worked and interacted together. So what he came up with, instead of this early Mendel periodic table, was something that more confined with systems you would see in nature, like this sine wave. This here periodic table has 9 octaves on it, with carbon at the middle, and he had all these harmonic nodes on there. And interestingly enough, all the elements that we didn't know about at that time fit into all these nodes. And he gave them funny names that ended up getting renamed afterwards because nobody ever paid any attention to his work. So he did them in these beautiful sine wave forms and spirals. And because he was just understanding and emulating how nature worked, he made his periodic tables worked in the same sense. So today we have the full periodic table as we know it today, which is pretty complete. There may be a couple of things missing, but so far it's looking pretty good. And what Russell's approach was to combine everything into these ways of how those elements interacted with each other in a more natural way. The ancient philosophers and alchemists were always observers of nature, and all the early scientists were too. Even people like the father of science, Isaac Newton, who's glorified as a father of science. It was really not known for the longest time that he was actually an alchemist, and he practiced a lot of alchemical processes and things in his laboratory, and did various translations looking for Bible codes and scripture and things like that as well. And recently his works come about, and we now know that he was a really successful alchemist, really. But in the end, what happens to a lot of alchemists is they experiment with a lot of metals and things like that. So that's what happened to Newton, is he went a little bit crazy at his time, and his family was rather embarrassed about his alchemical work and basically hid it away for many years until it recently reappeared at an auction somewhere at Sotheby's or something like that, and then now it's available for us to read. So what Walter was showing very complicated ways of how electricity was working, and he said that cathode waves wind the cosmic clock centripetally, and centripetal movement is opposite than centrifugal. So centrifugal is moving outwards from the center, and that's how most of our machines work today, with centrifugal force. They're always male, it's more yang energy, and it's explosive rather than implosive. And he said anode transverse waves wind it centrifugally. So the anode is basically the masculine or the yang style of energy, and centripetal, it'd be more yin and more a feminine concept. And that's more how nature works. It's an implosive system, how things organize, and everything, it's like a negative entropy where things become organized rather than disorganized and falling apart. So all our internal combustion engines and everything like that run on centrifugal forces. And what's important to take note in this chart is these sine waves down here, and how they're, the red one and the blue one are sort of 180 degrees out of phase, just for reference later on. So he also showed a lot of spiral movement and vortices. And there was another fellow around this time that I don't have in the slides here, who worked a lot with these vortices, was Victor Schauberger, and he worked with them in water. And so this was basically one of Russell's images showing how the forces in nature worked in both centrifugal and centripetal, and everything is perfectly balanced. And one of our problems today is that all our systems, we've kind of emphasized one side, usually the centrifugal side and the negative or the entropy side, where things just are meant to break down. So therefore your engines and things like that will eventually break down because of the violent forces that we use in them, rather than going in more harmony with nature. So this other fellow came along around that time who was a Russian physicist. And his name was George Lakhovsky. And Lakhovsky basically came over to America and met with Nikola Tesla to discuss some of these healing effects that he was experiencing in his laboratory. Because when Tesla was sitting in his high current or high frequency, high voltage systems with all those plasmas, he basically never got sick. And a lot of his friends came over, and he had a lot of famous friends like Samuel Clemens, who's the author of Mark Twain, and various other people would come and hang out at his laboratory here in New York just to experience the healing powers. But Tesla, even though he came up with the early versions of X-ray machines and things like that. He never really created a lot of healing devices, but everybody came to him for advice, and starting with this fellow here. And what he did was he created this machine he called the multi-wave oscillator. And the multi-wave oscillator had systems of a balanced Tesla coils inside of here that put the electricity onto these concentric rings. And basically you sat in between these two concentric rings, and each one of these rings was capable of transmitting a different frequency. So that's why he called it the multi-wave oscillator, because it wasn't just a single frequency, it had a wide spectrum of different frequencies. And again, these were all based on phi ratio. And he wrote a number of papers, and one of the things he said in those papers was that DNA acts as a self-inducing coil, allowing cells to function like tuned resonant circuits, capable of resonating to its resonant frequency when exposed to the range of frequencies output by the multi-wave oscillator. And you know, he wrote a lot of papers, one of them being called Curing Cancer with Ultra Radio Waves, which was another name that he used for them. And they actually started experimenting with these devices in hospitals. And there was one here in New York that they were using in a hospital. And then you know, unfortunately, Lukovsky got hit by 3 men in a black sedan and died shortly after. And after that, even though there was many people being cured of the cancer at that time, they took those machines out of the hospital shortly afterwards. These are sort of a smaller version of the concentric rings that he used. And what came off of those rings was this discharge that is called plasma. And it was the plasma that was exciting in the air and being produced by these frequencies. So what plasma is the fourth state of matter. So we have solids and liquids and gases, and sort of commonly accepted that plasma is the fourth state of matter. And even though we've been, you know, working with it for all that time, we're really just starting to understand what the plasma actually is. And basically what a plasma is when the electrons get sighted on gases, and in this case noble gases that we have in these tubes here, and then this is in most fluorescent light bulbs, and you know, plasma makes up everything. In fact, 99% of the universe is plasma, and 99% of the universe is also hydrogen as well. So those are important to keep to note. But so what happens when electrons move through these gases is they excite the outer shells on these gases, and the electrons jump off of those shells. And when they do, they emit a photon, and that's this photonic emission is the light you see. So different gases have different colors in their spectrum. And that's the way we do modern chemical analysis, is analyzing, because every element has its own set of wavelengths and frequencies. So Tesla turns out to be right, even though this wasn't until years later till we started to understand how everything works in these specific resonances and frequencies. So the entire universe is made up of plasma. The sun's a plasma. Even simple things like a flame is plasma, and fluorescent lights that we use today. And you know, I think it has a lot to do with creation, and I'm not a big fan of the Big Bang theory, that all the elements in the entire universe were created in the Big Bang and that's all there is. Because the alchemists always talked about a few things. They talked about consciousness, and they said, you know, it's not just humans that are conscious, everything is consciousness. And so I think the plasma has a direct connection to consciousness, and we've seen some really interesting things happen with the Theraphi and other devices over the years. And as well as plasma is sort of a interface between matter and the creative forces of the universe, basically. So here's a simple hydrogen electron, and this is the nucleus. It's only a single proton inside of hydrogen and a single electron on the outside. Now if you take this atom and to put it into perspective, if you took a grapefruit at one end of a football field and a pea at the other end of the football field, the proton would be the grapefruit and the electron would be the pea. And so there is a great distance of space between them. And the proton has a positive charge and the electron has a negative charge, but for some reason, you know, even though opposites attract, they don't actually pull into them. So there's some force that pulls them apart. And that force is what's creating this field, the field effect. And if there's that much space between these atoms, and so why don't all the subatomic particles kind of move aside? So when I put my hand to the wall, why doesn't it go right through the wall? Why doesn't everything kind of just shift through? Well, that's because of this field effect that is more an energetic effect that makes the mechanics of our reality. So another thing with the universe being 99% hydrogen, hydrogen has an important role that it plays in the makeup of water. So water is a dipole molecule, and it has two hydrogen atoms covalently bound to an oxygen atom, and those covalent bonds are very energetic, and they work like a little antennae. And so you have a positive charge on one side of the molecule and a negative charge on the other, and this bond angle is normally about 105 degrees, but it can stretch and it can move at 15 degrees in either direction. So that makes water very dynamic and very resonant to various frequencies. Of course, these are really high frequencies when you think of the size of the water molecule. In fact, the water molecule, everybody here knows, they've heard the story, you know, when you're born, you're like 90% water, and then you're like 2/3 water and all that. Well, in actual reality, but they're going by weight in that sense, but if you go by molecular number, your body's about 99.9% water once again. So there's that number again, right? And because the water molecule is so small, and all the other molecules that make up your body are quite large and quite heavier in comparison. So around that time, these plasma devices started being very popular in these electromedical devices. And this is an early violet ray tube that was utilizing a high voltage Tesla coil here. And these Tesla tubes that Tesla called a single cathode tube. And basically all the light bulbs and everything that we use today, and fluorescent lights and things like this, they have what's called the cathode and the anode. So it has two basic electrodes where electricity has to come and go. But Tesla was very fond of this single cathode lighting system. And these were quite popular at the time as well, in the 30s up until the 60s or so. You could buy these machines, again, commonly in any of the mail order catalogs. And what they were doing was producing that plasma within the tube. And here you can see the plasma jumping right out of the tube. And when this plasma is exposed to air, it chains the oxygens together into ozone. And ozone is not just like regular oxygen is O2, there's always two oxygens bound together mostly. But what it ends up doing is chaining them into O3, anything O3, O4, O5, O6, all the way up the line to these long chains of ozone. And everybody knows that ozone generators in your house will kill bacteria and funguses and stuff like this. It's actually the UV light that's emitted off of here is capable of disabling and breaking the DNA and RNA in various pathogens like viruses and bacteria and that. And all you have to do is hold this thing on the surface of your skin, and you can, just for a couple seconds, you smell it, you'll smell the ozone. So again, these are the kind of ads that came out in the magazines at the time. You could mail order them from the back of magazines, and many doctors were using them in their practice. And so for any kind of skin conditions, these devices worked very well. And they had all kinds of different attachments for various things. You could actually put them on your eye if you had an eye infection in your ear. And of course, I've been using these kind of things for many years, and I helped out a lot of people with just a simple violet ray type machine. So then on the West Coast, up popped this guy, and his name was Royal Raymond Rife. And this is another sort of unheard of character in history, but in his time he was quite a famous man, and various newspapers were publishing articles about him, popular science magazines, and what they were discussing was Rife's was basically a brilliant engineer. And what he did was he was able to build these very sophisticated machines. He was good friends with Carl Zeiss, and he built this universal microscope. And he was very good at machining, and he built, you know, even big 12-cylinder speedboat engines and all kinds of things as he grew up. And then eventually he had a laboratory in San Diego, and he had one room, you know, specifically isolated for his machine shop, another room specifically for all his electrical work, and then another bio lab where he kept laboratory animals to work on and stuff. And when he came up with this universal microscope, Carl Zeiss helped him out with designing the lenses inside of it. And what he was able to do was to see beyond the theoretical minimum wavelength of light. So he could see bacteria and viruses in this microscope. Now, nobody had done this at that time, and we can do it today with something like an electron scanning microscope. But our problem is, even today we use this electron microscope, scanning microscope, you have to actually kill what's on the slide in order to see it. So through this high energy beam, things are died. So we can only look at dead viruses, we can't look at living ones. And Rife was able to. And this microscope had 2,000 different moving parts in it. There's actually most likely still one in the Smithsonian today. The Smithsonian wrote several articles on this amazing discovery. And what Rife did was he said that he discovered the cause of cancer with this microscope, and he named it a virus. He said it was a virus, and he named two of them, BX and BY. And what he did was he isolated that virus, and he injected it into his laboratory animals, into rats, and they all got cancer. And he would grow the cancer tumor in the rats equal to the weight of the body of the rat. So a big, huge tumor on the side of the rat. And then he would surgically remove it. And then he came up with a way of treating the rat. So basically he would put the viruses underneath, the first thing he was doing was isolating the viruses and killing them under the microscope. So he had his universal microscope set up here, and then he had what he called the ray beam device. And this ray beam device is a plasma tube again, similar to an X-ray tube, and he had all this electrical equipment that was capable of sending out these frequencies into this tube. And I basically had a basic carrier wave, and he could, on that carrier wave, modulate these single frequencies, and he played around with frequencies till he saw that those viruses were destroyed. And what he called it was the mortal oscillating rate. So very similar to how an opera singer in a wine glass, an opera singer can hit the specific resonant frequency of that wine glass and then overpower its basic structure until it shatters. And that was essentially what Rife was doing. And so when he finished his laboratory experiments and all those rats lived to old age, they formed a committee and they gave him 16 terminally ill cancer patients. And he cured all 16 of them. And that became big news. It was published in all the papers across America, and they had a big banquet dinner in California saying it was basically the end of all disease and we have found a cure for cancer. But what was happening at that time was the American Medical Association was sort of just being formed. And pharmaceutical companies were starting to back the medical companies, because the pharmaceutical companies evolved from basically chemical warfare companies in the war, and they were producing bio weapons and chemicals like that. And so they had to move into new areas to keep the money going after the war. So they started into medicine and working with agricultural fungicides, pesticides, and all the things we know and love today. And so they were backing the American Medical Association, and basically they ended up putting a lot of pressure onto Rife and any of his technologies, because they kind of had dollar signs in their eyes, and they saw that cancer one day would be a very lucrative market. And what they did was they shut him down. They took him into court and made all kinds of legal proceedings against him. They went around America and they found every medical doctor, and they were forcing him to join the AMA too. At that time, a lot of doctors just didn't want to get on board with the AMA, because they saw, you know, the danger of having a state-run institution and then having the interests of, you know, corporations running this thing and the connection of that. But basically they threatened everybody with taking away their license to practice if they didn't surrender these machines and join the AMA. And that's what they did. They went around America and they found all these different machines, and then they completely destroyed them. Rife died a poor, broken man, and you know, just after years of persecution. And by the 60s, everything about electromedicine was written out of the textbooks. And I collect a lot of books, and I have all those early medical textbooks, and you know, they're just filled with all kinds of data and information of how electricity works in the body. And all that stuff just kind of got wiped out of the textbooks, and up until the 90s, you never really heard a lot in America about those things again. But human ingenuity is remarkable, how it keeps popping up all over. And what happened over in France was this guy came about, and his name was Anton Priori. And Priori was a naval radar engineer, and he had access to all this radio and RF equipment, and he started taking over where Rife ran off, and he was under the, you know, premise that bigger is better, so he built these massive plasma tubes, and he had a lot of equipment. And the way he came about discovering how this equipment worked with living things was he dropped some fruit one day behind his laboratory when he was working on these machines, and he realized it was there a month later, and you know, it was a banana or something like that, and it just basically never rotted. So he created this huge laboratory. The French government gave him $13 million at that time to do all this research, and he made these massive plasma tubes. This is actually one of his smaller ones that they're wheeling in on this cart. And this is more like one of his larger ones that was housed in this big room. So basically this is your treatment table down here where people would lay on, and this thing went up for 3 stories inside of the building. Yeah, and they did thousands of documented cases and researched, working first with animals and later with humans, into treating different diseases with this device, and they successfully documented a lot of cancer cures. And so this got written up into various French papers and documents and that, and there's a couple books. Some of it's been translated into English, and yeah, so you can find references to that online. And some of his machines were quite amazing. So basically, so what ended up happening was that at the end of that story was basically, after all these papers were getting published and that, all of a sudden just the information just disappeared. The French government became very quiet. Nobody had really seen Priori kind of just disappeared, and then, you know, and the whole idea just kind of faded away in Europe.
Quick question, what do you do?
Yeah, he experimented. That's how he started out, experimenting with the fruit, and he was keeping it from rotting. So there was all the different bacteria and stuff that would normally eat the fruit were basically getting killed by his machine. So he moved on from the fruit to animal studies, and then to humans. But again, that story just disappeared. Now, a lot of this concept of frequency has to do with how life itself forms. And the ancient Greeks, again, were ahead of the game, and people like Plato, who wrote in his book Timaeus, describing these Platonic solids and how the Platonic solids were basically the building blocks of nature. And anytime we look at anything very small, these are pieces of pollen, basically. They all have these geometric shapes that correspond with, you know, so here's a nice dodecahedron kind of combo buckyball kind of shape. This is a scanning electron microscope. So this is what I was saying about these are the modern ways that we can look at viruses and very small things. But when you do this electron that scans across here, basically it kills any living thing. So that thing is probably about 50 microns across. So we see these geometric patterns everywhere in nature. This is basically the center of a sunflower, and we see these patterns over and over again. And here's a piece of broccoli, and this is one of my favorite pieces of vegetables because of the fractality in this. I haven't really seen them here, but I see them over in Europe all the time. It's a special type of broccoli, and this concept of fractality and geometry is basically the building blocks of nature. And when people started, like when Mandelbrot, the fellow who came up with this Mandelbrot fractal, started describing this to people, you know, science just totally wouldn't, academia just didn't even go along with the whole idea. They said, ah, no, that's just too abstract. It couldn't have any possible relevance to anything, this fractal idea. And then because what we didn't have was computers that were able to generate these, you know, there were simple algorithms, but we could never, other than looking at a whole bunch of numbers and printout sheets, nobody really made any sense of what these fractals really did. And it wasn't until computers kind of caught up and were able to generate visual images of large amounts of data, because if you pitch, you know, imagine that the amount of data to make this here single fractal was very large in size, probably megabytes, you know, but at that time that was a huge thing. And so once we had computers that could generate that, we realized how these patterns are, you know, replicated over and over in nature. And we still use these fractal algorithms today in computer software generation for virtual reality type things, everything that has trees, and you can basically emulate nature, anything in nature, with these fractal patterns. So one of the very popular ratios in nature is this golden mean ratio. And this is basically a unit of 1 to 0.618033, this number goes on ad infinitum, similar to phi, or similar to pi. So this number is a ratio called phi. And here we see this logarithmic spiral that uses the Fibonacci sequence in these numeric equations. The Fibonacci sequence basically approximates phi because the numbers just go a little bit higher and a little bit lower. And so we see this ratio everywhere in nature. In fact, your whole body is made up of it. We're perfectly, everything in nature is perfectly laid out in these dimensions. So this here digit of your finger, if this was 1, then this would be 0.618 of that unit. And this would be 0.618 of the next digit. And then that's 0.618 of this and 618 of this and so on. So we see these things recurring in how leaves form on plants, and everything in nature, and especially water. Water has a really good affinity for this this phi ratio and molds to it, as well as air. Here's another good example of a plane with sort of a spray color that coming off of the wind to show you the vortices that's causing the lift on the wings. And again, this corresponds to this golden mean phi ratio. And what happens in water is as various different geometries can form. Earlier how we were talking about those bond angles on the water molecule, they form these clathrite cages. And when you hear things about structured water and that, these are what people are talking about, is these sort of cages that form in water. And water is very complicated. A lot of those bonds, the hydrogen bonds that basically bond the two molecules together, are very weak bonds. They're very loose, and they're continuously, water is very dynamic. And it's making and breaking those hydrogen bonds literally millions or billions of times a second. So forming these cages and getting them to stay in water is quite a trick. But what happens when things in nature occur, those geometries all kind of fall into play. And this is a vortex, as you would see in a sink when you pull the plug on your bathtub. And these are cymatic resonances of water molecules. So to show you how frequency and vibration have an affinity, how water has such an affinity with that, you can take a drop of this, it's just a simple drop of water on a piezoelectric transducer. And then when you vibrate that transducer at various different frequencies, you end up getting all these very complicated geometries. And everything in life, the fellow who did a lot of work with this, his name was Hans Jenny, J-E-N-N-Y, and he did all kinds of work with this cymatics, and a lot of the vibrational frequencies that he was forming would form what looked like life forms. You would see centipedes and spinal columns, and things would grow like legs and have digits on their fingers and things like this. So we can really see how much frequency has played a role in the creation of life and how things became to be. And it's always symmetrical, because we live in a duality nature. We have night and day, left and right, up and down. We're perfectly symmetrical beings. We live in this duality nature, and the ancients, would talk quite a bit about the duality in nature. And you look at symbols like the Taoist symbol of the yin and the yang. It has this perfect sine wave down the center, and the balance of the black and the white. And there's a little bit of yin in the yang and a little bit of yang in the yin. Going back to Walter Russell's work, we see that over and over again. So here's a nice golden mean spiral inside of a nautilus shell. And the nautilus shell, of course, is in water its whole life, and as it's being formed, it's a product of those natural resonances that are happening in water. And we listen to sea life and realize that all those geometries are part of how the vibrations, how everything communicates. You listen to the songs of whales and dolphins, they all use sound. And it's this combination of sound and light that forms the geometries. So, when you read the Bible, it says right in the beginning, in the chapter of Genesis, in the beginning was the Word, and God said basically, let there be light. So there's this sound and light interplay that correspond with the creation story. And we see this over and over in all different religions. So you can get very esoteric, and if you go into the Bible, and you can, once you have a deeper understanding of how nature works, you can find some really profound things in there. So these are the 5 Platonic solids that Plato had talked about. Now, in his time, there was basically the 4 elements, and what was commonly known was the tetrahedron, which related to fire, the octahedron air, the cube or hexahedron is earth, and this icosahedron related to water. Now, interestingly enough, going back to those geometric shapes that were in the water is very easily formed into these icosa shapes. It's a little trickier to get the tetrahedron and the octahedrons, but there definitely can be formed with water molecules. The hexahedron, however, is really tricky, but it can be done. It can be, water can go all the way down to a 90-degree bond angle, but when we look at water, when it goes into that 90-degree form, it's very depleted sort of water of its energy, of its life force. So we see anything in nature that's cubic is very earth-oriented and elemental. So here's a couple other key things in the geometries. This is the vesica. Then this is what you see on the back of people's cars. You know, the symbol of Jesus is actually this vesica from the geometry. And these toroidal forms will be very important in a little bit here. So this is my partner, Dan Winter. And a couple of years ago, Dan came up with this book that it's an algorithm that he wrote this book about. And this algorithm is based on Planck's length and Planck's time. And Planck's length is basically the smallest unit of measure that we use in quantum mechanics. And so with that, he was able to predict the radii of hydrogen, because this is a very small unit of measure, and we've never really been able to accurately understand how those fields inside of the atomic structure, the spacing and how they came about. But he used this algorithm which utilized Planck's length and phi ratio to come up with these series of resonant nodes. And so here you can see this sort of caduceus waveform that is very similar to what you would see in nature, similar to a pine cone. And Dan's always been big on what we call phase conjugation. And phase conjugation is well known in optics. It's basically a way of looking into a glass that can distort an image and then have it reflected back to it and rebuild it. So it goes into disorder, and then when you have a second reflection of those phase angles coming back, it comes back into order. So it's kind of a simple way to visualize phase conjugation. And basically this concept of these waves getting smaller and smaller towards this Planck's length point are how this algorithm is used. And Dan said to me, do you think you could come up with a machine that we could use these frequencies in to make some kind of healing device? And we were looking at the work of Anton Perori and Royal Rife. And basically I've been building these type of machines since the 90s. So what happened, we go back a bit to what happened after the 60s, when all this electromedical concept kind of got, taken out of the picture. We used these modern machines like electrocardiograms and electroencephalograms to look at brain waves, electrocardiograms look at the heart. So we know that the body uses this electrical principles, but modern medicine just sort of used it for diagnostic tools and left out the treatment side of it. Then back in the 90s, this fellow came along named James Baer, and he came up with this way of recreating the Rife machine using a ham wave or a ham radio amplifier, and putting in a specific waveform from a function generator into a modified CB, and then driving a plasma tube. And so I was part of these Rife group, and we had these meetings. We started out on Vancouver Island and went up to Edmonton, and then later moving down to Las Vegas. But every year we would get together, and everybody was slowly gathering all this information about Rife. There was another key fellow at that time, his name was Barry Loynes, who wrote a book called The Cancer Cure That Worked. And that book basically told the whole Rife story, and it was a really interesting read. And so all of a sudden people started digging around in hospital basements and things like this, and they started finding in their archives all this Rife type information. We started assembling it all and rebuilding these machines and figuring out all these frequencies. And then we found databases of frequencies that people were using. And today we have a database of about 6,000 different protocols for various different ailments and various frequencies that utilize them. But what Rife was doing when we talked about that mortal oscillating rate, those were sort of destructive frequencies. So you got the opera singer with the wine glass shattering these bacteria and viruses and these kind of things. And so I made those for many years, and I thought, well, why not come up with a constructive device? If Dan's algorithm is based on nature, and this is a sort of a frequency signature and a very complex waveform of how nature works, well, then it would be more of a constructive frequency set rather than a destructive frequency set. So we kind of took this concept of the phase conjugation of these sort of pine cones kissing, if you picture that, and built this into these plasma tubes. So it's using multi-wave frequencies, just like Lakhovsky was doing with his multi-wave oscillator. It's using plasma, like Rife was doing with his ray beam device, and then it's using something new to the picture, is this concept of phase conjugation. And what happens with these frequencies as they're being generated by these tubes, they're basically meeting at the middle. And you know, everybody's familiar with Kirlian auras, and this is some of Krakow's work measuring the bioenergetic field around the body. So these two tubes now are generating these frequencies, and they're meeting at this 0 point at the center. And what's happening is these it's very similar to the inside of a core of a toroidal system. So we see these toroids again in geometry.
Which system?
Toroid?
Toroid.
Yeah. So this is the core. Like picture it like an apple core on the inside of a toroid, and this is the outside of the torus here, right? So there's the center. And so what these tubes are doing is they're generating these two toroidal fields. And these toroidal fields, the plasma itself is actually twisting. So the tube is basically the core of here. So if you picture this tube being generating this thing, and what you don't see is the toroidal field that's around here. But these big toroids are spinning in opposite directions at each end of the body, from the top of the head to the tip of the toe. And they're meeting at your Dan Chin, your hara point, you're basically. So, you know, people have always talked about in different cultures and religions and things about chi and energy and prana, those kind of things, all these things that relate to the vitality, the life force of the people. And in Taoism, they say that center point is right here at your Dan Chin. And so what's happening is these two toroids form these vortexes. So this is one of them, and it has this inward spiraling vortex and this outward spiraling vortex, like we saw in Walter Russell's work. But this particular case, it's forming two counterspinning toroids. So basically, your Dan Chin, as you're laying on the table, is right here. Now, this is a popular image that's been popularized by the movie The Thrive, that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, and Nassim Harameyn's work. And essentially, this is creating that exact field. And we see that over and over again in nature. So here, to give you an idea of that central core of the toroid, is two of these tubes in sort of in the dark. When, you know, they don't look like they're lit up very much here, but perhaps at the end we'll dim the lights a bit so you can get a really good visualization of the plasma inside of here. And basically, you know, this is a Matty Clarwine, or not Matty Clarwine, it's Alex Gray painting, right? And you can see the energetic field around the body. Basically, we are dealing with this bioenergetic field. We're recreating these frequencies of nature, and we're putting ultimately about 300,000 volts from the top of your head to the bottom of your toe. I call this the human battery charger, because people always use these words like, oh, I'm feeling weak, or I'm drained, right? There are all these analogies to a battery. So essentially, we need the energy for our metabolism and for all our biological functions to work properly. And what I see this device is really doing is it's really providing us with the energy we need to increase our cellular metabolism, increase your cellular uptake, and most importantly elimination, because every cell in your body, because of that voltage potential, gets a little micro massage from these frequencies as it's continuously going back and forth. So what's happening here is similar to a magnetic field, as well as it's an electromagnetic field. So we have this electron field, as well as a magnetic component to it. And as you lie on the table, these fields cancel each other out because there's a transverse wave that's being generated. That's the, maybe I'll go forward here. Okay, yeah, so there's this transverse waveform that's being generated by the equipment that runs this machine. And there's also a longitudinal component. And a longitudinal wave, just to clarify, because people banter all these words about longitudinal waves and scalar waves and all these kind of things, so I really want to set the record straight for what they really are. Okay, a longitudinal wave is simply a pressure wave. It's like a sound wave. So as my vocal cords are resonating the molecules in the air, this longitudinal wave is moving this way, and then your eardrums resonate with that longitudinal wave, and your brain gets a neural synapses, and it decodes the signals that you're getting, and you are interpreting my voice. So that's what a longitudinal wave is. Or if you had a slinky and you had it stretched out and you pushed on that slinky, you know, you'd see that that movement of these waves moving down the slinky. And basically this electromagnetic spectrum we'll get into in a bit, but so here's the transverse wave, and that's just simply the wave form you'd see on an oscilloscope. And so here's sort of a slinky showing these harmonic nodes and antinodes in this longitudinal form. So now what's happening is those waveforms, when they meet at the middle of this, they cancel each other out because they're 180 degrees out of phase. So if you add up the positive side of this line, if this is your zero line on an oscilloscope and this is negative, when you add these two together, they equal to 0. So it creates the 0 point right here. And when those components get canceled out, that's when you have the scalar component that comes into play. And the scalar, I picture more like a field. It's more of a field effect than a wave. And we don't really have any equipment to properly measure that. But if you look into the work of like Tom Bairden, and you'll see he gets quite deep into how to understand what scalar waves, and it also has to do with Maxwell's original equations in his quaternions. See, the modern electrical theory that we have are taught in universities in Maxwell's equations have sort of been castrated. They're simplified by a fellow named Oliver Heaviside, and so this whole concept of where things go when they disappear, which is what's happening here, where's all that energy going, go into this part that Maxwell was explaining in his original equations, but they got simplified and we don't pay any attention to that anymore. And a lot of this technology has been used for various other kind of things, as I'm sure you can imagine. So basically that's how the machine is working and what it's kind of doing. We're driving in the car, coming back from the store with Dan, and I said, you know what it's like? It's like the temple in Dendera with those serpent tubes in there, and everybody says, yeah, the Egyptians had electricity, and these were probably light bulbs and that, and so we ended up using that for the logo for the Theraphi. But so that's basically what this machine's doing. We're at the stage right now. It's basically it's a scientific research instrument at this point. We can't, of course, make any claims. We're sort of gathering anecdotal evidence of what it's doing right now. We want to take it to clinical trials. We're going to go to the next stage. And you know, eventually we would like to see it approved as an official medical device. But for right now, it's a scientific research device. The next stage to it, it'll be considered a wellness device or an energetic device. And it won't be that way, you know, because we can't make any medical claims until we've gone through all the trials and done all that. But we have had some really interesting testimonials that you can look at. We'll have on.